How does neurobusiness bring together brain science, human psychology, and also business outcomes?
Yeah, it's funny. When I first started the company in 2010, the market penetration for neuroscience was something like 1%. And I was there when that was happening, because I would say things, people would think, oh, you must be some academic scholars and we talk about theory of the brain that has nothing to do with business. How are we gonna, how am I gonna manage this? And they were like, no, I'm not really interested. I don't need to know about brain science. I want to know how to make more money. And I would say, well, to me, there's one very simple translation. Businesses are made up of people, and people have brains. So if you want to change the businesses, the business plan, the business outcomes, you really have to change the people. And to help to change the people, changing their brains is one approach to doing that. In fact, a study by Keller and Price from McKinsey & Company showed that mindset shifts offer 4 times more effectiveness than just changing people's behaviors. I think John Carter has also talked about the fact that changing behaviors is critical. You can't change behaviors unless you're changing mindsets. So essentially, business outcomes are dependent on people, and what neurocoaching does is essentially, and I call it transformational neurocoaching because we start off with there's a lot of take-homes, a lot of literal, practical stuff, like the stuff we're talking about, like the 3 forms of confidence, or CIRCA, or the 4 forms of re-energizing your brain. But it's transformational because you really have to get engaged. In my 3-day training program, what I do is actually ask people. We go through a very sort of embodied experience where people get to some really deep issues. Ernst & Young has done a series of studies recently in businesses showing that business outcomes are strongly connected to a sense of purpose. And sense of purpose does not mean virtue signaling. It's not like, oh, here's what I want to do for society. Here's why I love other people. It's like sense of purpose. From Aristotle was one of the people who I think offered one of the most effective ideas about sense of purpose. Aristotle essentially said that it really was about what makes you flourish. What makes you feel like you are flourishing? Because when you are flourishing, you have an emergent, real, authentic need to serve whoever you love. If you are dying quietly on the side and someone is saying, oh, you need to be able to pay attention to green initiatives, you could be the most socially conscious individual on earth. You'll do it, but with a very low energy, to bring that word back into the conversation again. Whereas if you feel like you're flourishing, there are like a million different charities to want to give to in the world. I happen to, for example, like the arts, because I feel like the arts are very sort of underrepresented in our society, and inner city kids. Those are 2 things that when I'm flourishing, I'm especially in touch with. Man, I want to develop this program that connects this, that gives. And when you feel excited about your own charitable giving, it becomes less about saying, pat me on the back because I'm a charitable person, and more about authentic giving. And so I think transformational neurocoaching is using some of the basic tenets that we talked about to help people change their brains, but asking much deeper questions related to existential confidence, psychological defenses, ways in which, one of the things I meant to say earlier was I find it amazing that Daniel Kahneman, the behavioral economist, got a Nobel Prize for demonstrating to us that human beings are pretty much incapable of making decisions without being biased. But somehow we believe, we accuse people when they're biased. We tell them, oh, you can't believe you have that bias. Our brains are made to support our internal biases. So unless we examine our internal biases and are aware of them, we're not going to know about the psychological traps we fall into. So John Hammond has published in Harvard Business Review psychological traps that business leaders can fall into. For example, the sunk cost trap. It's a very effective, having a series of questions like, am I throwing good money after bad? Is it just because I've already put a lot of money, I'm going to pour more money into that initiative? Or should I say I got to cut my losses and move ahead? Asking yourself those kinds of questions is important. But fundamentally, the reason transformational neurocoaching matters is I think, because of Warren Bennis's definition of leadership. So Warren Bennis is one of the foremost thinkers. His late now. He had been around for many years on leadership development. And I, for someone who studied leaders and studied different definitions of leadership, his definition of leadership is so simple, but I think really key. And for me, this is really where my whole approach to transformational neurocoaching emanates from. He says becoming a leader is synonymous with becoming yourself. It is precisely that simple and also that difficult. And if you think about it, it's like becoming, like what is that? Well, becoming is about translating a state of being. Well, so becoming a leader, how do I become myself? Well, I am myself. Well, really? I mean, how much of ourselves do we bring to work every day?
What would you say are the typical unconscious obstacles that stand people's way, and how would you recommend that they overcome them? I know we touched on a few in the previous answer.
Well, I think a big one is fear. The reason circa is so important is because when unconscious fear impacts the brain, it doesn't manifest as fear, it's unconscious. So if I ask somebody, what are you feeling right now? They say, I'm fine, but I just can't solve this problem. And so by decreasing unconscious fear, using methods like circa, you can actually much more effectively manage your brain and manage what's going on unconsciously. But there are other things as well. So for example, Pierre Marty and his colleagues belonged to the French school of psychosomatics. And they discovered through their thinking that, and through seeing really hundreds of patients, that there was a condition they found called essential depression. And essential depression is not a state where you feel depressed mood or where you feel badly about yourself. It's something I believe is epidemic today, which is that it's a state in which you have a lack of vitality. And what they found was that lack of vitality, like not getting up, not being able to spring out of bed, not being able to feel energized, not being able to feel like, man, I love what I'm doing at work. Like work just feels free and real to me. That this lack of vitality correlated with hyper-rationalism and action orientation, which suggests that rational thought and action are both very important, but they can also be unconscious defenses against things that are more non-rational, not irrational, non-rational, and things that are more complex. So when you stick to rational thinking, it can actually make you feel like you don't have vitality, because all you're doing is just behaving like an automaton. You're behaving like those machines that are coming ahead. Whereas, and the other thing about this that I find particularly important is that they found that thinking too rationally and only being action-oriented all the time, bottom line, bottom line, bottom line, bottom line, those two things actually correlate with having more physical disease. And there's a whole biology behind this that demonstrates that if you don't engage these non-rational parts of yourself, if you lock up your emotions, for example, you're causing stress to your body. Repression and suppression can actually change your blood pressure. So you really want to be able to tap into these emotions that you've ignored. A video that I show in my training sometimes is one of my favorites is of Lady Gaga, who actually reached a point in her career where she said she didn't want to sing anymore. Lady Gaga not wanting to sing anymore. She's so successful. She's very good at it. Why would she not want to sing? And what she said was, I just reached a point in my life where I just felt like I was doing things I didn't like to do. I was selling perfumes. I don't like perfumes. I was taking selfies. I have more to offer the world than that. And so I realized at a particular point that every day I was going home to bed, I was going to bed with someone I couldn't recognize. And I would ask people to think about that. Like, how much of our essential selves are we representing in our daily work? And what she said was, I then decided to say no. People would say, I want you to do the selfie. She said, no, I don't want that business. I don't want to feel like I'm just a money-making machine that doesn't have some kind of soul. And she said, when I got home that evening, I actually, after I said no to a bunch of big things, I looked at myself and she looked at herself in the mirror, and her words, she said, you I can live with. Like, you I can sleep with, because you have integrity and you have courage and you can represent who you are. And so what I say to people is, ask yourself, is there something in your life you can say no to right now? Something you can say no to. Start with something simple, like your physical health, or not making time for exercise, or staying too late at work, or accepting your, there's two kinds of ways of moderating self-esteem. There's self-esteem maintenance, SEM, and self-esteem optimization, a different kind of SEO. And what a lot of people do is they live their lives in self-esteem maintenance without trying to optimize their self-esteem. And so one of the things that I talk to people about is we really have to deal with these unconscious obstacles to a sense of possibility. I was born in South Africa, and when I came to Harvard, the way that I came to Harvard was I picked up the phone and called her. I called and I said I wanted to speak to the head. People said, and at that time there was no internet. I just literally went through an operator, and I just thought, well, I want to go to Harvard. Why don't I just call? An examiner I had from NYU the year before told me that he thought I should be at Harvard, and I didn't even know where Harvard was. And so I picked up the phone, and I eventually got through. They were like head of Harvard, and I got through the medical school. I got through the Department of Psychiatry, and the head of department happened to be there. I ended up working at that hospital. I couldn't get an appointment for months. But he picked up the phone, and he said, hi. And I said, hi, my name is Srini Pillay. I'm sitting in a small dorm room, and I'm thinking, boy, wouldn't it be great to be at Harvard? And he told me later, I thought, you're crazy. But I thought, yeah, you and everybody else. And so he basically said, I had to be decent. So I said, well, why don't you send me your CV and send me a note? Now, I had done particularly well, but there are a lot of people in the world who've done well. But not everybody who's done well would take that particular action. And so he circulated it. I got a phone interview from Jonathan Cole, who was the father of psychopharmacology. And a week later, I got a FedEx saying, congratulations, welcome to Harvard. Now, had I not been in that state of possibility, like if someone asks me now, how do you get into Harvard? I don't think I would say, oh, just call up the head and say you want to be there. I think I would say there's a way to go about it. But is there really a way to go about it? Because what if you can be in the state of possibility where you open up the defenses against that? So you ask, I'm responding to your question about what unconscious things can you address. I have an index called the Possibility Index that asks people to look at some of these unconscious variables that are blocking their sense of possibility. Now, in that year, I had just moved from my hometown, which was in Durban, to Cape Town, and I just had the most incredibly inspired life. I'd made a bunch of friends. I did most of my work in the first half of the year. I spent my evenings having cocktails and mixing with it was like a lot of amazing, sort of beautiful energy that was happening, and I think that made me feel like I could afford to have someone shut the door in my face and say no. But if you're not in that state of inspiration, the last thing you want is someone to say, "Are you crazy?" And so, if you think about the unconscious things the possibility index is an index I give to people so they can identify what's in their way. Is it the fact that they're lost? Is it the fact that they're depressed or anxious? Is it the fact that they're burnt out? Is it the fact that they're just stuck in habit circuits in their mind? Is it the fact that they don't have this capacity for imagination? And once they go through all of the lists, they identify the top 3 things that are in their way. And then we work at some of the unconscious factors that are surrounding those unconscious factors that can help them clarify those things for themselves.
You mentioned at the start around sort of imaging of the brain and blood flow in the brain. And when I first came across this concept, it was some of the work that Dave Asprey done with Daniel Amen when Dave was trying to understand how his brain was working. So what are the sort of like the really big insights you've had around doing brain imaging and then how that then translates to things like anxiety and confidence?
Sure. So what Dave did is a different kind of scanning. I think he probably did SPECT scanning. What I studied,
it was SPECT, yeah.
What I studied was functional magnetic resonance imaging, which is brain blood flow. I'll say up front, there's lots of debate in academic literature. Some people are like, this is great. Some people are like, this is horrible. Some people are like, it's in between. This is what we're fighting for. But we're making progress in the applications of this because there are studies that correlate changes in brain blood flow with changes in behavior. So essentially what I studied was, like in people who are afraid, for example, what goes on in the brain when you are afraid, but you're not aware of it. And so there you can see that if I show you a fearful image, even for 10 to 30 milliseconds, your amygdala goes off, but you don't even know that you've seen that image. So that gives us proof that's exactly that the brain is impacted. And then you can see that there are things going wrong in the frontal cortex as well, in the thinking brain. And because things are going wrong in the frontal cortex, you can now say, well, so actually, even when you don't know that you're afraid, your brain's anxiety center is flooded with blood, and there's not enough going on in the frontal cortex, so your capacities are diminished. And then you can do pre-post studies, like many of the techniques that I talk about, like with Circa, where you show that if you use one of those techniques in Circa, the blood flow changes. So now you've got a higher level of evidence to show that you can actually change someone's brain with this technique, because you look at their brains before the technique, things like affect labeling, for example, that I talked about, labeling the emotion, or things like reframing, or things like distraction. These are all things that can change brain blood flow literally. So the one way in which we use this information is to provide a higher level of evidence. Once you do what I'm doing right now, which is sort of integrating a lot of this information across different studies, you also come across some new insights that challenge what you might be thinking without knowing the brain science. So if you know the brain science, you know that the unconscious is being affected, and you know that, for example, goal theory is something that's come from a lot of brain science. A lot of people say, oh, well, all you have to do is have a goal and then illuminate and write your steps toward it, and you can get to your, I don't know, this doesn't work. It doesn't even, 97% of diets fail. Like, why is that? It's because goals compete in the brain. And there's a theory called selfish goal theory, where we can see that goals compete with each other, and it doesn't really allow you, even though you have a goal in your mind, your chocolate goal is always competing with your exercise goal. And your chocolate goal's got like big nuts on it, right? Your chocolate goal is like, oh yeah, you want to compete with me? That's great. And you can say 1,000,000 times to yourself, I'm going to exercise, I'm going to exercise, I'm going to exercise, I'm going to exercise. All your chocolate goal is to say, oh yeah, your chocolate goal just gets up, flexes its muscles metaphorically, and the 100 times you said, I'm going to exercise, doesn't work. The way this translates to brain imaging research is this actually pertains mostly to psychological research rather than just brain research. But deliberate practice, the people hear about this 10,000-hour goal. People are always talking about Malcolm Gladwell's idea. Well, deliberate practice has been largely researched through meta-analyses, and there's been a very contradictory finding that's emerging. So if I asked you, like we think for sports people and musicians, like practice must make a difference, right? I mean, if you practice more, you probably get better. But if you look at the success pie and what contributes to success, the percentages are in the 20s. It means 80% of success has to do with something other than practice. And if you look at this related to education, like we think for people to study harder and do better. Education, practice makes a difference of 4%. And if you look at jobs, practice makes a difference of less than 1%. So here we have this major disruption in what's going on. And the brain science gives you a very different understanding of this. Another area where brain science helps us understand things is grit. Right? We often think that grit changes brain blood flow, and if you persevere, you're going to get there. Really, that's not what it's about. Like, grit actually has very poor correlations with success. And for grit to work and impact the brain the way you want it to, you have to have essentially you have to have a growth mindset, a much more open mind, open to possibilities. So at the basic level, brain science helps you understand a greater level of evidence for things that are already being taught. But at a higher level, once you start integrating this, you see that it gives you insights that are actually quite different from things that we might assume had we not been looking at the brain. And as I said, the neurocoaching is not just about the brain science, it's also about the psychological sciences as well.
I'd like to thank Dr. Srini Pillay for his time and insights. Do check out Srini on his social channels. Friendly reminder, do visit www.upgradedexecutive.com, subscribe, and we will send you a special link so you can access the videos 1 week before we officially release them. You can follow us on all our social channels at Connect with UE and our website www.upgradedexecutive.com. upgradedexecutive.com.